character that governs our being. One of the things that's so remarkable about the Old Testament, this is another thing Nietzsche commented on. He was a real admirer of the Old Testament, not so much of the New Testament. He thought it was a sin for Europe to have glued the New Testament onto the Old Testament, because he thought the Old Testament was a really accurate representation of the phenomenology of being. It's like, stay awake, speak properly, be honest, or watch the hell out, because things will come your way that you just do not want to see at all. And it might not just be you, it might be everyone you know and everything about your culture that is demolished for generation after generation. It's like, stay awake and be careful. And I think that people only don't believe that when they're being hubristic. And I think that most people know that deep in their hearts. You know, when you get high on your horse, that happens fairly often. If you have any sense, you think, geez, I better be careful and tap myself down a fair bit, because if I get too puffed up, man, something's going to come along and take me out at the knees. And everyone knows that. Pride comes before a fall. It's like, if you have any, that's why it says in the Old Testament that the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. It's like, I've never, in all my years as a clinical psychologist, and this is something that really does terrify me, I have never seen anyone ever get away with anything at all, even once. You know, there's that old idea that God has a book, you know, and keeps track of everything in heaven. It's like, okay, you know, maybe it's not a book. Fine. But that is a really useful thing to think about, because, well, and maybe you disagree. Maybe you think people get away with things all the time. I tell you, I've never seen it. What I see instead is that thing happens, right? Someone twists the fabric of reality. And they do it successfully because it doesn't snap back at them that moment. And then like 2 years later, something unravels. And they get walloped and they think, oh my God, that's so unfair. And then we track it. It's like, well, what happened before that? This. Well, then what? This. And then what? This. And then what? Oh, this. Well, that's where it went wrong. It's, yeah, because you can't twist the fabric of reality without having it snap back. It doesn't work that way, and why would it? Because what are you going to do? Twist the fabric of reality? I don't think so. I think it's bigger than you. You know, and I think that one of the things that really tempts people is the idea that, well, I can get away with it. It's like, yeah, you try. You see how well that works. It's like you get away with nothing. And that is the beginning of wisdom. And it's something that deeply terrifies me. And, you know, ever since last September, when I came to more broader public attention, one of the things, I'd be terrified of making a mistake, because I certainly know I'm more than capable of making a mistake. And thank God so far, either I haven't made one or no one's found out about it. So, but it's like, you know, we walk on a very thin and narrow edge. And we're very lucky when things aren't degenerating into chaos around us or rapidly moving to far too much order. And it's not an easy thing to stay on that line. And you can tell when you're on that line, because things are deeply meaningful and engaging when you're on that line. But if you're not existentially terrified about the consequences of wavering off that, then you are truly not awake. So, and that's what I see in this picture. You know, it's like, look out, man, because there are rules, and if you break them, God help you. So one of the things that seems to me the case with regard, I mentioned this in the question period a bit last time, is that one of the things that seems to be actually one of the advantages to gluing the New Testament onto the Old Testament is the idea of a transformation in morality that is analogous to the Piagetian idea that after you learn to play by the rules, you can learn to make the rules, because I think that's actually what happens to some degree in the transition between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Because in the Old Testament, most morality is prohibition. Here are things you shouldn't do. It's like, you know, fair enough. And that's a lot of what you do with your kids. Don't do this, don't do this. Especially when they're happy, you're always going around telling them to stop being so happy, because all they're doing is causing trouble. It's quite painful if you're a parent and you notice that. But the first morality is prohibition, right? Control yourself so you don't cause too much trouble. And then maybe if you get that down and you're good at it, then the next thing is, well, once you're disciplined, then you can start working towards something that's a positive good. And that's the transformation that seems to me to be fundamentally characteristic of the juxtaposition of the New Testament onto the Old Testament. But in these images, it's still something like serve tradition, serve the Father, psychologically speaking, support the tradition, because you live on it. There, in an old Mesopotamian story, the Enuma Elish, which you can read about if you're interested in, the original gods, who are really badly behaved, they're like 2-year-olds. In fact, they're a lot like 2-year-olds. They kill the primordial god, Apsu, who's the patriarchal god. They kill him and try to live on his corpse. Well, that's what we all do, right? Because we live on the corpse of our ancestors. You could say we live on the corpse of our culture. It's dead. And that's not a great place to live. So you have to keep revivifying it so the damn thing, stays active and awake. You stay on the corpse for too long, and then the devil or the demon of chaos comes back, and that's what happens in the Mesopotamian story. It's like, don't be thinking that you can stay on the corpse of your ancestors for too long without contributing to the revivification of the system, because the chaos that all of that holds at bay will definitely come and visit you. And you see that in stories like The Hobbit. Hobbits, they're nice, they like to eat, they're kind of fat, they're short, they're not very bright, they're hubristic, they have no idea what's out there in the broader world. They're protected, if you remember, by the Striders, who are the sons of great kings who look like tramps. They have nothing but contempt for them. They patrol the borders and keep the bloody hobbits safe. But out there in the periphery, all hell is brewing and chaos is generating and forming. And that's an archetypal story, and that's why people like that story so much. Because that's exactly right. Like, we're the hobbits, and we are protected from chaos by the spirits of our dead ancestors, and we're too damn stupid to know it. And we think, oh, well, we don't need them anymore. And that, to me, that's postmodernism. That's what the bloody universities are doing with the humanities. It's absolutely appalling, and we will pay for it. So, unless we wake up, and hopefully we'll wake up, because that would be better than paying for it, even though being awake is rather painful. So then I had this vision one time, and I kind of portrayed it in this image of what the world was like. And I thought, well, it's not a pyramid. It's not a single hierarchy of authority. That's not what it is. It's an array of hierarchies of authority. So you imagine this sort of infinite plane, and in the infinite plane, there's nothing but pyramids. And inside the pyramids, there are strata of people. Everywhere, far as you can look. Some of the pyramids are tall, some of them are short, they overlap. It's endless, the plane is endless, and those are all the positions to which you could rise. And everybody's inside the pyramid, sort of crammed up, trying to move towards the top. And then there's the possibility of sailing across over top of all of them and seeing how the structure itself works. And that's the eye that floats above the pyramid and that sees the structure itself. And the highest order of being is not to be at the top of the pyramid. It's to use the discipline that you attain by striving towards the top of the pyramid to release yourself from the pyramid and move one step up. And I think that's one of the things that's instantiated in the idea of for example, of the Holy Ghost. So, and I think that's akin to that. That's Sisyphus. And Nietzsche said of Sisyphus, if I remember correctly, that one has to imagine him happy. Well, if there's a rock at the bottom of the hill, then you might as well push it up the hill. And if it rolls back down, well, then you've got something else to do, don't you? You can push the damn rock back up the hill. And there's no shortage of rocks to push up the hill, and that's what we're built for anyways. And so let's go out and push some damn boulders up the hill, and then maybe we could have enough self-confidence and enough respect for ourselves that we wouldn't have to turn to hatred and revenge and try to take everything down, because I think that's the alternative. So he's not weak. That's one thing you can say about him. The same idea represented there, right? That's Atlas, who voluntarily takes the world on his shoulders. It's like the idea of Christ taking the sins of the world on his shoulders. It's exactly the same notion, which is the notion that you should be able to recognize in yourself all the horror of humanity and take responsibility for it, because that's what that means. And the thing that's so interesting about that is that if you can recognize in yourself all the horror of humanity, you will instantly have a hell of a lot more respect for yourself than you did before you did that. Because there's some real utility in knowing that you're a monster. Now, and just because you're a monster doesn't mean you have to be a monster, but it's really useful to know that you are one. So, one of the things that Jung knew, and this is something that I find so amazing about his writings, I think something that really distinguishes him, for example, from Joseph Campbell, who talked about following your bliss, is like Jung said very clearly that the first step to enlightenment is the encounter with the shadow. And what he meant by that was, everything horrible that human beings have done was done by human beings, and you're one of them. And so if you don't understand that, and to understand that really means to know how it was that you could have done it. And that's a shattering thing. To try to imagine that, to try to imagine yourself as someone who's engaged in medieval torture, to see how you could in fact do that. You're never the same after you learn that. But being never the same after learning that is unbelievably useful, because when you understand that that's what you're like, then you're a whole different creature. And I don't think, and this is something I did learn from Jung, is that you cannot be a good person until you know how much evil you contain within you. It is not possible. And it's partly because you just don't have any potency. Like, if you're just naive, if you're just nice, if you've never hurt anyone, you've never hurt a fly, you don't have the capability for any of that, why would anyone ever take you seriously? You're a domestic animal at best, and a rather contemptible one at that. And it's a very strange thing, because you wouldn't think that the revelation of the capacity for evil is a precondition for the realization of good. But I believe, first of all, why would you be serious enough to even attempt to pursue the good unless you had some sense of what the consequence was of not doing it? You have to be serious about these sorts of things. It's not the game of a child, right? It's the game of a fully developed adult. And I learned this in part when I had little kids. I wrote a chapter for my new book called Never Let Your Children Do Anything That Makes You Dislike Them. And why was that? And I wrote that after I knew I was a monster. And I thought, I'm going to make sure I like my kids. I'm going to make sure they behave around me so that I like them. Because I'm way bigger than them. And I'm way more cruel than they are. And I've got tricks up my sleeve that they cannot even possibly imagine. And if they irritate me, I will absolutely take it out on them. And if you don't think that you're the sort of person that would do that, then you are the sort of person who is doing it. We're not going to get to Adam and Eve, haha. I watched this great documentary once called Hitman Hart. It was about Bret Hart, who was the most famous Canadian in the world for a while. And he was a worldwide wrestling federation wrestler, and he was a good guy. And he came from this famous family of wrestlers who all came from Alberta. I think there were 7 brothers who were wrestlers and 7 sisters, and all the sisters married wrestlers. And they were all offspring, children of Stu Hart, who was a wrestling impresario like 40 years ago. And it was such a cool documentary, because I was always wondering, why in the world do people watch wrestling and believe it, believe it? Do you believe movies when you go watch them? It's like, that's a hard question to answer. Well, you're there, you do. And so if you're watching wrestling and you're a wrestling fan, do you believe it? Well, it isn't a matter of belief. It's a matter of being engaged in a drama. And there are different levels of drama, right? So let's say Worldwide Wrestling Federation drama is not the most sophisticated form of drama. Okay, but I'm not being a smart aleck when I'm saying that. There's drama of different sophistication for different people. And that's also why religious truths exist at multiple levels simultaneously, right? There's got to be something in it for everyone. And that's a hard belief system. That's a hard system to put together. Something for the unbelievably sophisticated and something for the common person. Okay, so we have wrestling, and Bret Hart was a good guy, and he fell into the archetype of being a good guy, and that's partly what the story's about. It was a bit too much for him. But one of the things that he laid out so carefully was because he figured that 120 million people knew him, something like that, and that everywhere he went, he was treated like a hero. And he found that quite a burden, as you can imagine if you think about it. But he portrayed what was happening in the wrestling ring as classic good against evil, but not conceptualized and discussed, right? Embodied, fought out, acted out, like Thor and the Hulk, except like right in front of you. And so, well, that's exactly this sort of thing. I mean, we could consider hockey more sophisticated than wrestling, perhaps. And as I said, I'm not being a critic of these. I'm not being critically minded about these things. I understand their purpose, and I would highly recommend that documentary. It's a brilliant documentary. But it's the same thing. It's a silver cup, right? It's like, there's the hero of the team. That's the hero of the teams. No, here's something cool. If you're the fan of the Toronto Blue Jays, or the Toronto Maple Leafs. Of course, this hardly ever happens to you if you're a fan of the Toronto Maple Leafs, because they always lose. But if you're watching a game and your team wins, and we take your testosterone levels, then they went up. And if you watch the Toronto Maple Leafs and they lost and you're a fan, then your testosterone levels go down. So that's pretty damn funny. You know, I mean, really, don't you see how deeply instantiated this is in people? I mean, it bloody well alters your biochemistry, like your testosterone levels. It's all, oh, my team lost. You know, it's like there'll be nothing in it for the wife tonight. You know, so. Well, this is the cosmos, I think, from the phenomenological perspective. And one of the things that has come to my realization is that this is real. This is real. It's not a metaphor. It's way deeper than a metaphor. The most real things about life are the place you don't know and the place you know. And you could say, well, that's explored territory and unexplored territory. That's real, and it's been around forever. Back to the lobsters. You know, if you put lobsters in a new place, the first thing they do is go around their territory, finding places to hide, and also making a burrow. So the first thing they do is establish what they know against what they don't know. And that's real. It's real from the Darwinian perspective. And we're going to say that what's real from the Darwinian perspective is plenty real enough, because we're alive and everything, and so that sort of thing matters. It's like, well, that's what this is. The Taoist symbol, that's what it says. Is it says, what is experience made of eternally? That's easy. Chaos and order. And in every bit of chaos, there's the possibility of order. And in every bit of order, there's the possibility of chaos. And that's the way, right? That's the path of life. That's life itself. And where you're supposed to be is right on the border between the two of those. And why is that? Stable enough, engaged enough. Right? So not only are you doing what you should be doing, you're doing it in a way that increases the probability that you'll do it better tomorrow. And you can tell when you're doing that because you're engaged. You're in the right time and place. And your neurology tells you that. That's what meaning is. That's what transcendent meaning is. And that's so cool, because I also think that is the antidote to existential suffering. The antidote to existential suffering is to be at the right place at the right time. And you know, you want to get technical about it. Okay, anxiety and pain. That's the reality of existential suffering. Okay, so let's say you're in the right place at the right time. What happens to you biochemically? Dopaminergic activation. What does that do? Suppresses anxiety, and it's analgesic. Now, it's more than that, because it also produces positive emotion and the desire to move forward, and it underlies creativity. And so not only do you get the positive engagement from a neurochemical perspective, you get the analgesia and you get the and you get the reduction of anxiety. So it's not hypothetical, and it is the case that the dopaminergic systems, those are the exploratory systems, unbelievably ancient and archaic, are activated when you're optimally positioned to be incorporating new information, which is what human beings do, because we're information foragers. And so we want to be secure, but building on our security at the same time. And then we want to do it for ourselves, we want to do it for other people, we want to do it for our families, we want to do it for broader society. We want to bring the whole world together in alignment to do that, and that's meaningful. And God only knows what we could do about the suffering of the world if we did that. You know, we have no idea what we could do if we started doing things properly. And maybe so many of the things that dismay us about life, we could stop. I mean, we stopped a lot of them in the last 100 years. You know, things are a lot better than they were 100 years ago. Obviously, they're not perfect. But 100 years ago, 120 years ago, man, you know, the average person in the Western world lived on less than $1 a day in today's dollars. It's like, you just try that for a week and see how much fun that is. So, the Taoists, well, what is this? Well, this is the pre-cosmogonic chaos out of which the Word of God extracted habitable order at the beginning of time. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. And that chaos, we'll talk a bit more about that later, I guess, because it's a very complicated thing to describe. But it's certainly the thing that when you encounter, the chaos is what you encounter when the Twin Towers fall. Right? You remember what that was like, right? So it was September 10th. Well, that was the world. Everyone knew what the world was like. And then it was September 11th, and everyone walked around dazed for 3 days because the buildings fell. But so what? You can see a building fall. You can understand what happens when a building falls. So then what's going on with the being dazed? Well, it's the chaos that underlies our habitable order manifested itself when those buildings collapsed. It was a brilliant act of terrorism. And everyone was frozen and curious because that's how we react to that sort of thing. It's like the shark. Remember that famous movie poster from Jaws with the woman swimming on the top of the water and that terrible Leviathan shark underneath coming up to take her out. Well, that's life, man. That's the world. And now and then you see that. And when something falls like the Twin Towers fall, you remember that the ocean below you, the abyss, right, the primordial abyss, that bloody thing is deep. And you're fragile. And that happens when someone betrays you. And it happens to you when your dreams fall apart. You encounter that chaos again from which the world is extracted. And when you're called upon to act out attention and the word in order to bring the world back into order. None of that is superstitious. None of that is superstitious. None of that's even metaphorical. It's real. It's more real than anything else. And I think the reason for that in part is that this has been this way forever. Right? As long as there's been life, this has been the rule of life. And that's the cosmos, that's reality, that's what we inhabit. And so one of the things, the so-called new atheists, and I don't want to go on a tangent about new atheists because I think atheists are often remarkably honest and very consistent in their analysis. But I just don't think they're taking the problem seriously now. I don't think they take their evolutionary theorizing nearly with the seriousness that it necessitates. And I don't think that you can dispute the proposition that the longer something has had a selection effect on life, the more real it is. It's a fundamental axiom of Darwinian biology. And I think the Darwinian world is more real than the physical world. That was the argument that I was trying to have with Sam Harris. I didn't do the world's best job of that, although it went not too bad the second time. But it's not something to be taken lightly. It's a very serious, profound, and meaningful proposition. And people act it out and want to act it out whether they know it or not. That's Marduk. So the story of Marduk, I'll just give it to you very briefly. Tiamat and Apsu are locked in embrace at the beginning of time. Goddess of salt water, god of fresh water, together. Chaos and order. Right? They give rise, masculine and feminine, they give rise to the world of the elder gods. And those are, to me, they're primordial motivational forces. They're something like that. And their rage and their lust and their love and all these things that possess us that are there forever. And they're out in the world acting. And they carelessly slay Apsu, their father. And they're making a racket, and then they kill Apsu. And then Tiamat gets wind of that. And that's Tiamat right there, by the way. She's kind of a rough-looking creature. And she's the mother of all things. And so she's not very happy about this. Her children have destroyed structure itself. Plus they're noisy, careless. And so she thinks, all right, just like Noah, just like the God that brings the flood to Noah, exactly the same idea. Tiamat comes back and says, yeah, okay, enough is enough. I'm going to take you out. And she makes this battalion of monsters and puts the worst monster there is at the head of the battalion. His name is Kingu. He's like a precursor to the idea of Satan. And she lets the gods know, hey, I'm coming for you. And so they're not very happy about this because they're gods, but like, yeah, she's chaos herself. She gave birth to everything. This is no joke. And so they send one god out after another to confront her, and they all come back with their tails between their legs. There's no hope. And then one day there's a new god that emerges, and that's Marduk. And the gods know, as soon as he pops up, they know he's something new. Remember, and this is happening while the Mesopotamians are assembling themselves into one of the world's first great civilizations. So all the gods of all those tribes are coming together to organize themselves into a hierarchy to figure out what proposition rules everything. And so Marduk is elected by all the gods, and he says, look, I'll go out there and I'll take on Tiamat, but here's the rule. From here on, you follow me. I determine destiny. I'm the top god. I'm the thing at the top of the hierarchy. And all the other gods say, hey, look, no problem. You get rid of chaos, we do exactly what you say. Now Marduk, he has eyes all the way around his head, and he speaks magic words. Those are his primary attributes. And so he takes a net, and he goes out to confront Tiamat. And he encloses her in a net, which I think is so cool because it's an encapsulation, right? It's a conceptual encapsulation. He encloses chaos itself in a conceptual structure. He puts it in a net, and then he cuts her into pieces, and he makes the world. And then he creates human beings to inhabit that world and to serve the gods. And he creates human beings out of the blood of the worst of the demons. And that took me to Colin DeYoung, who's a student of mine, helped me figure that out. I thought, that's pretty pessimistic. It's like, what exactly? It's like a fall metaphor. It's like the idea of original sin, but our joint conclusion with regards to that was that human beings are the only creatures in creation that can truly deceive. Right? We have the capacity for evil, just like it says in the Adam and Eve story. We can actually do that, and that's why we're made out of the blood of the king of the demons. We are the thing that can deceive, that can twist the structure of reality. Well, so Marduk. Now, the Mesopotamians had an emperor, right? And the emperor was the avatar of Marduk. That's what made him emperor. He was only an emperor if he was going to be Marduk. He had to be a good Marduk, which meant he had to confront Tiamat, chaos, and cut her up and make order out of her pieces. And what the Mesopotamians used to do at the New Year's celebration, they'd go outside their walled city, and that's explored territory versus unexplored territory. They'd go outside their walled city into chaos, and they'd bring all the statues that represented the gods, and they'd act this out. Because they're trying to figure something out, right? They're trying to figure out what this means. They're acting it out. And then they'd take their emperor, and the priest would make him kneel, and they'd take all his king uniform off, his emperor uniform off, and make him kneel and humiliate him and nail him with a glove and say, okay, how were you not a good Marduk this year, right? And then he'd recount all the ways that he was inadequate in confronting chaos, and then they'd do the celebration, and Marduk would win, and the king would go sleep with a royal prostitute. The reason for that was it's the same idea as St. George pulling the virgin from the dragon. It's exactly the same idea, that if you encounter the reptilian chaos, you can extract something out of it with which, if you unite, you produce creative order. That's what they were acting out. And that was the basis for the Mesopotamian idea of sovereignty. It's so smart. It's so unbelievably smart. And, the Mesopotamians had a massive influence on the civilizations that then had a massive influence on us. It's one of the stories of how the notion of sovereignty itself came to be. It's the evolution of the idea of God. That's one way of thinking. But even more importantly, it's the evolution of the idea of the redemptive human being, right? And that's taken to one of its conclusions, well, in the story of Buddha, but also in the story of Christ, the idea of the perfect individual. And the notion is, well, that's the word that speaks truth into chaos at the beginning of time to generate habitable order that is good. That's the story. And so with that, I'll just show you these pictures because they're so interesting. Once you know what they mean, they're so cool. That's the symbol of infinity. That's Hercules and the Hydra. What's life like? Cut off one head. What happens? 7 more grow, right? What do? Run home? Well, no, that's not what you do. This is what you do. You fight it. It's the chaos that generates partial chaos. It's the ultimate chaos that generates partial chaos. But that chaos also is what revivifies life, because otherwise it would just be static. Mercury, the head of the Hydra, right, freezes you. That's St. George. He's doing it peacefully, which is so interesting, right? He's got a beatific look on his face in that particular representation. Another St. George, right? The Virgin in the background. I think that's St. Anne, if I remember correctly. I'm sorry. St. George, he's the patron saint of England. Here's an interesting one. This actually sheds light on the human proclivity for warfare. St. George, that's a Muslim soldier it's really easy to transform the enemy into the dragon, right? Because the enemy is often the predator, and we do that instantaneously, right? Without a second thought. And so then we can go to war morally, because why not take out the snakes? Well, the problem is, where are the snakes? Well, maybe they're outside, and maybe they're not. Maybe they're in this room, and even worse, maybe they're in you. And that's wisdom, when you know that they're in you. Why wouldn't she be happy about that? Especially if she had a child, right? Seriously. And that's Horus, right? The god of vision. And he was a falcon, because falcons have great vision. They fly above everything and they can see everything. And so that was the Egyptian creator god, Horus. And I'll tell you the story about Horus at some point as well. Now, here's some pictures that demonstrate what I had described as the emergence of, let's say, the meta-hero out of the hero. So there's the person you admire, and then there's the set of people that you admire, and then there's the meta-set of admirable people, and the extraction of that ideal. As far as I can tell, that's just what's portrayed in these images. That's a great one. It's a very sophisticated image. You see the two sides of Christ's face are not symmetrical. One's God and one's man. That's that icon. So the fully developed person in this representation is one of the oldest representations of this sort that we know. The idea is that there's the human person in his ordinariness, let's say, and then there's this kinship with the divine that's associated with the willing adoption of the responsibility of mortal being. And that produces this union, and then it's manifest in a book, right? Because that's speech, and it's associated with the sun, right? It's the proper way of being. And that's a perfect example, I think, of the emergence of the archetype out of the multitude. That's what it looks like to me. So, I guess now we're done with Genesis 1, and that took 3 lectures, but God's complicated, that's the thing. So, thank you, and next week, by all appearances, that's where we are. So, we've got 20 minutes for questions.
So, in the past, I've done some work with Big Brother, Big Sister, and whatever. That being said, the most common story I tend to hear from people is that they're raised in a single-family home, usually with a mom, daddy's either on the picture, an alcoholic, whatever. So, we have this child who is trying to seek ways to make himself healthy and empower himself in ways that a healthy father should have done so, between the formative years of like 1 to 4. So I think you know where I'm going with this. Let's say for someone who's born without like a good father figure, where would they go out in the world, or like what spheres of influence would they try to expose themselves to like gain access to that fountain of health and knowledge that a good father figure should have provided them to in the first place?
Okay, well, certainly to some degree, a good mother can provide that, right? To some degree. Although it's hard for one person to be everything.
Right.
And I think one of the conundrums that face women, and this is a tough one, and this is why I think women are higher in trait agreeableness and higher in trait negative emotion, is that, the primary problem that a woman has with an infant is why not throw it out a window? Because it's very annoying, right? It's there all the time. It's constant demand. It's absolutely constant demand. Tremendous dependency. And so a woman has to be tilted towards mercy. That's how it looks to me. Right. And especially it's so important during especially the first year when children are so unbelievably vulnerable. And so I think it's very difficult for women to be merciful like that and to make the shift to encouraging disciplinarian. I think that's a very difficult thing for people to do simultaneously. Although, people, I'm not saying that women are always only merciful and men are always only encouraging disciplinarians, but things do sort themselves out to some degree like that. And I think also the biochemical transformations that accompany pregnancy and childbirth and lactation also tilt a mother towards that as well. She has to really love that little thing, right? It's number one, no matter what it demands. And then telling it what to do and making sure it's behaving properly, that's a whole different issue. Now, but the kids who lack fathers, I mean, first of all, they can find that to some degree in their friends. And that's often what boys do in particular. They go into gangs. And they generate the missing masculinity in the gang. Well, that's not so good because, like, what the hell do they know? They don't know anything, right? They're just stupid kids, and they're like 15 years old, and their testosterone is pumping, and they're trying to get the hell away from their mother, which is what they're supposed to do, and they're not in the right position to exercise any authority over themselves. So that's not good. They can find it in education, they can find it in books, they can find it in movies, they can find it in sports heroes, and so forth, because the image of the father is fragmented and distributed among the community. But it's very, very difficult to not have a father. And you know, one of the things that we're doing in our society, which I think it's absolutely appalling, is that we're making the case that all families are equal. It's like, sorry, no, wrong. And there's no empirical data supporting that proposition, by the way. It's much better for kids to have two parents. Now, who those parents are, that's a whole different issue. But.
Okay, and if I could just add one more thing. How would you answer that question to, let's say, a daughter who was raised without a father? Because she would obviously have different ways of finding those fragments of her missing father than, like, a boy would instead. Because obviously they're raised differently. Well, at least they should have been.
Well, I think it's the same issue, you know. I mean, I think that another danger that emerges, and this is Freud's, of course, famous observation, is that, you know, if there's mom and child, or father and child, that relationship can get a little closer than it should. And then the lines get blurry and mixed. And I'm not saying that that happens to everyone, obviously, but it's still a danger that's inherent in the situation. They're thrust together too tightly without sufficient resources. And so the responsibility has to be distributed. Like, I really do think that it's the sign of the degeneration of society when single parenthood becomes anything approximating the norm. It's not a good idea. And part of the reason I believe that, and I think this has to do with the overwhelming selfishness of modern life, is that marriage isn't for the people who are married. It's for the children, obviously. And like, if you can't handle that, grow the hell up. No, I mean seriously.
Yeah.
Seriously. Once you have kids, it is not about you. Period. Now, that doesn't mean it isn't about you at all, but that just seems so self-evident to me. I can't believe that anybody would even question it.
Oh, it's being questioned.
Oh, yes. Well, I'm
horrible.
certainly aware of that. Yes, it's questioned. It's almost illegal to question it now. You know, or illegal to make the set of propositions that I'm making. So that's the best I can do.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you.
This question is going in part to the first half of your lecture, but it's also something that's been on my mind listening to your lectures over the past few minutes. And that's when we talk about the psychological truth or significance of the Bible. To what extent does that psychological truth have to be embodied in specific historical events or people? And so, for instance, the thing that's sort of been bugging on my mind is there's a part that St. Paul's talking about in the New Testament somewhere, in one of his letters, and he's talking about the resurrection, and he says, if it didn't happen, then this whole thing is just meaningless. The faith is meaningless. Like, for him, there had to be that embodiment of that historical person or event in that case.
Well, the best answer I have to that at the moment is that I'm really happy that I'm not at that point yet in this lecture series. You know, because there's a crucial issue there, and I don't know exactly what to make of it. And my approach at the moment, as I said, is to approach this as rationally as I possibly can, and I hope I know a hell of a lot more about what I'm doing by the time I get to that particular question. And I do have the beginnings of ways to answer that, but I'm not going to answer that at all right now because it's so bloody complicated. It would just burn me to a frazzle, and I'm already mostly burnt to a frazzle after that lecture, so I couldn't attempt to even start to sketch it out. I don't know. I mean, part of it is to be just rational about it, just to be rational about it. There is something about the idea that continual death and rebirth is a necessary precondition to proper human adaptation. Like every time you learn something new, that's important. Part of the stupid old you has to die. And sometimes that can be an awful lot of you. And in fact, it can be so much of you sometimes that you just die, right? You just can't handle it. And so there is a real idea that you have to identify with the part of yourself that transcends your current personality, that can constantly die and be reborn. Now, then I could say, well, that means that all of this is psychological and symbolic. And that's the simplest answer. But I'm not satisfied with that answer, even though I think it's coherent and complete. Because the world's a very weird place, and there are things about it that we don't understand. So I can't go any farther than that at the moment. So, yeah.
Hi, Dr. Peterson. I just recently watched one of your videos of you debating with transgendered protesters at UFT free speech rally in October, and one of the protesters said to you, which was in particularly very chilling, was, why do you have the right to determine whether an individual is worthy of you using their pronouns? The scary thing to me is how common this type of view is among radical left-wing protesters on university campuses who feel they have the right to tell other people what they can think, what words they can use, and what speakers they can or cannot listen to. The even scarier part is that our government is creating legislation to back up their ideologies, which is evident through Bill C-16, M-103, and Bill 89. So my question is, what do you think the end game is in all of this? Because it seems every year...
We're in the process of finding that out. You know, and I'm sorry. Okay, we're in the process of finding that out. I think the end game that underlies all of that, in my estimation, is best summed up by Jacques Derrida's criticism of Western civilization. It's phallogocentric. Now, we've already talked about what the logos means, right? And so for Derrida, that was a sign of its utter, what would you call it? The utterly despicable, dominant nature of Western culture. Well, that's what animates the postmodernists. Now, they may not know that because an ideology gets fragmented across its adherents, and then it only acts as the coherent ideology when all those adherents come together in a mob. And then you see the animating spirit. So, I think that there's a battle going on that's a battle exactly at the level that Derrida described, and that's a theological battle with a philosophical implications, and out of those philosophical implications come political implications. But it's not primarily political, and it's not primarily philosophical. It's deeper than that. And the postmodernists are out, their criticism was designed to be fundamental. And it also emerged out of Marxism. And let's not forget that the Marxist criticism was not only fundamental, but just about resulted in the nuclear annihilation of the world. These are not trivial issues, and we're back in the same insane boat. And so, what do I think should be done about that? Well, I've thought about that way before any of this happened, and I think that what we should do about it is we should tell the truth, because there isn't anything more powerful than that. And that's the right theological answer, because the spoken truth brings good into being. Well, that's the phallogocentric idea. And I'm trying to revisit that to explain to people what it means and to see if they think that's a good idea. I mean, that's what we have to figure out. Is that an idea worth adhering to or not? The alternative is see, for the postmodernists, the world is that landscape of pyramids that I described. But there's no transcendent vision that's over above that. And all of those pyramids are equally valid, and it's a war of everyone against everyone. It's like the nightmare of Thomas Hobbes, except that it's not individuals, it's groups. and everyone's a group. You're a group. You're whatever your group is. It's like, that's death, as far as I'm concerned. It's utterly reprehensible. And we better sort it out, because if we don't sort it out, we are bloody well going to pay for it. So,
Thank you.
that's Bob and Doug McKenzie, right?
Yeah.
Hey, how's it going? Yeah.
I'm glad you caught that.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I did a Facebook poll.
Yeah.
Some people who are familiar with your work, and a question kind of rose to the top. Just right out of the blue. It's spectacular. And what it was, you didn't really touch it here, but you touched it a bit in your lectures. It was about integrating the shadow.
Yeah.
And one of the main questions was, how does one go about that, especially in the modern world? You know, like we're usually sheltered from anything resembling that kind of concept. You know, we don't engage like the unknown. We don't come into life or death situations. Most of us, unless we work as like an ambulance, you know.
Well, that's one thing you can do. Well, that is one thing you can do. You know, is that you you can search out experiences that put you there. That's you know, because you can do that as a volunteer, for example. I mean, you can. One of the things I saw once was in Montreal. I was in this outdoor mall in Montreal on St. Hubert, and I saw this great big 17-year-old kid, you know, and he had a mohawk and he was dressed in leather and with studs, and like he was doing the modern barbarian thing, and he had it really down. And he was standing on the corner with 2 pink shopping bags. So I was looking at him and I thought, if someone offered him the opportunity to drop those goddamn sleeping bags or shopping bags and go fight with ISIS, he'd be there in a second.
Yeah.
Right, because what the hell is some monster like that doing standing on the corner of St. Hubert holding 2 pink shopping bags? So some of it is that you need to find out where you can push, where you need to find out that edge that you can push yourself against. And it's going to be different for different people. But that's the call to adventure and heroism, and there are life and death situations everywhere around you if you want to involve yourself in them. Now, sometimes that might be like to put yourself together to the degree that you can, say physically or spiritually or intellectually. It could be an intellectual battle, it could be a moral battle. Like the frontier is everywhere. The frontier is just the edge between what you know and what you don't know. You want to put yourself on that.